Jim, the floor is yours.
All right.
Yeah.
Good afternoon. We're in Amsterdam. I just love the city. But what I'm really passionate about is community. So it's great to be with so many people who share my passion.
Do you need a microphone?
I don't think so, do I? Yeah. So let's just start saying, I think there's two different paths to addressing community needs. One path is about providing services and advocating for people to make sure people's rights are met. And that's really important. The other path is about how do we support communities to raise their own voice and to do for themselves. And both are absolutely essential. But they're two very different kinds of ways of working with our community. Service delivery is really done through agencies. And by agencies, I mean government, and I mean nonprofit organizations that tend to operate largely through staff and budgets that tend to be more top-down. And associations are just community members coming together to do collectively what they can't do individually. Democratic organizations, very different. That service delivery tends to focus on people as clients and volunteers. And when we do things through associations, people are citizens. I will. Okay. Sorry. That seldom happens.
Okay, I'm sorry. Okay. So in associations, people think of themselves as citizens. Now it's too loud, probably. In service delivery, we tend to focus on the needs of people, and we're doing things in a community way. We tend to focus on people's gifts, on their strengths. Service delivery tends to be a one-way relationship, where we're just doing 2 people or 4 people. And in community, it's about reciprocity, recognizing everybody has gifts and everybody has needs. And community is all about supporting each other's needs with each other's gifts. 2 very different types of ways of operating and meeting needs. And as I said, both are really important. But in our society, and I'm talking all over the world, what's happened is we've tended to move towards service delivery and we've forgotten about burger crop. And that's starting to come back. I think most of us know that there's a relationship between danger and opportunity, that crisis can also provide opportunity. And the good news is we have lots of opportunity right now. The bad news is we have a lot of crises that are facing us. And the first crisis is a crisis of our democracy. And I see this as an issue here, and clearly in the United States, where we just shut down our government, where we've got government spying on people. But I tell you, everywhere, there's a crisis of democracy, where people are thinking of themselves as taxpayers and ratepayers rather than as citizens. And we have fewer and fewer people who are voting. And every form of government has taxpayers. Only democracies have citizens. And when people start seeing the government as a problem, our democracy's in a huge state of crisis. And in Seattle, some of our community associations were so angry at our city government that in one neighborhood they simply erected a rocket on the side of one of their businesses and they announced that it was aimed at City Hall. A second crisis that's facing our society is the economic crisis. The very time where people's needs have been the greatest, our agencies of all kinds, government, nonprofit organizations, have had the fewest resources to respond. So people are starting to rediscover the value of community, that all they can really count on is each other. And that's been the silver lining to me of the economic crisis, that both people in communities and agencies are starting to rediscover the value of community. And the third crisis is the crisis of climate change. And again, people are starting to wake up to the fact that government alone can't solve the issue of climate change. That it really requires all of us to think in a different way, to start taking more responsibility for each other and the place we share, to start working as a community again, If we just think of ourselves as individuals, what difference does it make if I don't act responsibly? I'm one person on this huge planet. But it's in community we feel some sense of responsibility, some sense of accountability. So I want to share a story about the power of community to deal with the environment. And this story is one of our neighborhoods in Seattle. Seattle has about 700,000 people, but our neighborhoods are more like 5,000 people, much smaller scale. And one of our neighborhoods I want to talk about right now is Ballard. And the program that supported this project we're going to talk about is one I'm going to talk about a little bit later, Neighborhood Matching Fund, which is a program we supported out of the city government that provides a cash match from local government in exchange for the community's equal match of volunteer labor in support of community-initiated projects. Okay? So Ballard was the neighborhood of Seattle that had the least number of street trees of any neighborhood in Seattle. And they also had the least number of parks of any neighborhood in Seattle. I don't know if the story's true or not, but it's largely Scandinavian neighborhood. And they said when the Scandinavians came to Seattle, they were so tired of not seeing the sun, they chopped down all the trees. Right? There was a woman in Ballard who cared passionately about trees. Her name is Dervilla Gowan. And so she put notices in the local newspaper. And she put them in a corner grocery store, advertising for other people who shared her passion for street trees. And she tried to find somebody at every block in Ballard. And if nobody came forward, she'd go to that block and knock on every door until she convinced somebody they shared her passion for street trees. And then she got them to sign a pledge form saying, I'll come to a training about how to plant and take care of the trees, and I'll recruit my neighbors to do the same thing. She turned in all of her pledge forms to her matching fund application, and one day, trucks pulled into her neighborhood with 1,080 trees. Dropped them off at every block in Ballard. Dervilla went and knocked at the door of the block captain and said, the trees are here. Block captain knocked on the neighbors' doors. That day, over 1,000 people came out and planted trees up and down the streets of Ballard. People felt incredibly empowered. Beginning of the day, there were no street trees. The end of the day, they had tree-lined streets. Look what we can do when we work together as a community. They said, well, this is great, but we still have the fewest parks of any neighborhood in Seattle. So they walked around the neighborhood looking for potential park sites and had a hard time finding them because the neighborhood's pretty developed. But they finally found an old rundown house that used to serve as a nursery. And it was right next to the business district, huge public safety problem. They convinced the city government to buy that property for a park. And the government had some money to buy the property, but no money to design or build the park. So the neighbors did it themselves. Local landscape architect volunteered her services and worked with the other neighbors, and together they designed and built Baker Park. This is the entranceway into the park, some of the landscaping. There were some beautiful old trees in this park, and one of them had died. And they're trying to figure out how to remove it. And then one of the neighbors, who was Native American, had a better idea, and he carved it in place as a totem pole. And here's some of the detail. This group went on the next year, and they tore up all the asphalt around the school. And they put in greenery. Much better for the environment, so the water can percolate through the soil. And much better for the kids and for the neighbors, because now they have a park where they used to just be asphalt. We call it gray to green, and now we do it around all our schools. But it's another innovation that comes out of community. This is a piece of property in the neighborhood that was platted as a street. It's owned by a transportation department. There's houses on either side, but it was never developed because it's too steep. Cars could never make it to the top. So as a result, it just became overgrown, became a huge problem. Lots of rats would gather in this high grass. The only thing to try to get up were four-wheel drive vehicles. They come in the middle of the night, they race their engines, challenge each other to make it to the top, drive the neighbors crazy. Finally, the neighbors went out with picks and shovels, dug through that heavy hard-pan clay soil by hand, hauled these timbers up the side, and terraced that whole problem hillside, and turned that problem hillside into a community garden. This is now one of 85 organic community gardens we have in the city of Seattle, all built by neighbors. We have 7,000 urban gardeners, and collectively they donate 3 tons of organic produce to our food banks every year. And this is the group's most recent project. This is the site of another former house, so to commemorate the house, they built all the furniture out of cement. And at the dedication for this park, they unveiled a timeline that shows the 20 parks they built over the past 20 years. Every one of them with volunteers. They built ball fields. They built playgrounds. They worked with the kids to build a skate park. They restored a natural area. They're reclaiming a salmon estuary. 20 parks in 20 years, all volunteer. They said, this is great. We've made our neighborhood a much better place, but we're concerned about what's happening to the planet. We're concerned about climate change. So they organized an all-volunteer group called Sustainable Ballard. And every year, for the past 10 years, they've had a big festival in their central park, and it's called Sustainable Ballard Fest. And they have music and food to draw people in, and they have booths to educate neighbors about what they can do to reduce their carbon footprint. And the first booth you go to is the undriver's license station, where you go and check all the ways you will not drive over the next month. And when you do, you get a laminated undriver's license. It looks like my official Washington State driver's license. So Julia Fields, when organized this, she says, I'm going to walk, bike, take transit, etc., etc. And when you do, when you get your undriver's license, it entitles you to drive the shuttle bus. This is like a Fred Flintstone mobile that's going down the streets of Ballard, pedaled by feet, and it gets everybody's attention. It gets people thinking, what can I do to get out of my car? What can I do to reduce my carbon footprint? This has created a movement now. All the neighborhoods around Ballard have organized their own all-volunteer sustainability groups. All the suburban communities around Seattle have done the same. We now have 67 of these all-volunteer groups, and collectively they call themselves Scallops. Sustainable communities all over Puget Sound. And it all started with Derville Gowan and those street trees 20 years ago. There's incredible untapped potential in our communities. And it's the only way we're going to deal with climate change. Well, in the same way that communities are best suited to deal with climate change, they're best suited to do most things we care about. Margaret Wheatley has a great quote, whatever the problem, community is the answer. That there is clearly a role for government, there is clearly a role for nonprofit organizations, but there is absolutely no substitute for community when it comes to the things we care most deeply about. And here's some of those things. I already talked about caring for the earth, caring for one another, preventing crime. You could have a police officer on every street. People wouldn't feel as safe, and it certainly wouldn't be as appropriate as neighbors just watching out for each other. You know, police officers can enforce laws, but only communities can prevent crime. We spend way too many resources lining up the ambulances at the bottom of the cliff, when the job of community is to build the fences at the top. Responding to disasters. Colby is one of Seattle's sister cities, and another sister city of Seattle's is Christchurch. I went to both places after the earthquakes. In both places, they told me the number one thing we learned is there's no substitute for neighbors knowing each other. But we often learn that when it's too late. Promoting health. There's studies that show that about 15% of health outcomes can actually be attributed to healthcare professionals. In many ways, our communities can have a much bigger impact on our health, on our behaviors, on our mental health, on the social, economic, environmental, physical conditions that impact our health. Our happiness is dependent on strong communities, the local economy, creating great places, social justice. In my country, no major social changes ever come top down. Every major change has come bottom up. Civil rights movement, the women's rights movement, the disability rights movement, the gay lesbian rights movement, the environmental movement, the anti-war movement, every major change has come bottom up. So without strong communities, we can't make change, we can't get social justice. And our very democracy is dependent on strong communities. The problem is, at the very time we most need our community itself is in its greatest state of crisis. How many of you know Robert Putnam's work? He wrote a book called Bowling Alone, professor at Harvard University. The most depressing book for those of us who care deeply about community. Because he tracks the incredible breakdown of community life in North America over the past 50 years. How fewer and fewer people belong to the traditional associations like the Bowling League and the Rotary and all those kind of groups. And how fewer and fewer families are eating dinner together. and how fewer and fewer people are voting. All kinds of indicators of the breakdown of community. And he cites a number of reasons. I've added a number of my own, but one is single-purpose land use. It used to be that we live, learn, work, and play all in the same village or neighborhood. And now it creates single-purpose places, bedroom communities where we just go to sleep. Malls where we might drive a half hour to go shop and we're losing our main streets. We might commute an hour to work. In a sense, we have many different communities, but in a sense, no community at all because we don't bump into the same people over and over again. Increased mobility. It used to be generation after generations our families would live in the same village. Now, how many people here have moved more than 5 times over the course of your life? And some of us many more times than that. And if you're always on the move, it's hard to build relationships. If you know you're just going to move again, why bother? It's a lot of work. More time working, more and more people in the workforce, more women in the workforce who've always been leaders in our community efforts, less time to devote to community. Fear, it's been documented in many neighborhoods as a key thing breaking down community. Whether or not people have a reason to be afraid, you're living behind closed doors. And the more you're behind a closed door and you don't know your neighbors, the more fearful you become. It's fear of the unknown. Electronic screens, Robert Putnam said the biggest thing breaking down community is television. People say they don't have time for community. You have to spend an average of 3 or 4 hours a day in front of the television set. Researchers recently reported that young people are spending an average of 10 to 12 hours a day in front of screens of all types. Social media can be a great thing to reinforce relationships, but it can't be a substitute. Globalization, where products and decisions are made further and further away from where we live. And I think perhaps most damning of all, the very agencies that are trying to help our communities are contributing to the breakdown of our communities. Where we have more and more professionals doing for communities what communities used to do for themselves. And where every agency is specialized. Everyone's got a laser-like focus on their mission, on their function. So we have one set of silos for the old people. And we've got another set for the young people. And we've got another one for the people with disabilities. And you can't build community in silos. Now in communities, we're having to organize ourselves the way the agencies are organized. Who's serving whom? So fortunately, I think because of all these crises, both people in communities, both citizens and agencies are starting to rediscover the value of community. Starting to get that balance back again, moving towards how do we rebuild that sense of community rather than just doing for communities. And here's the steps I think that agencies of all kinds need to take in order to be really good partners with community. And it also requires a paradigm shift on the part of community. It requires us in communities to think in a very different way as well. So just the parallel shifts. I said government, but that's also true of all NGOs, all kinds of agencies. To recognize that neighborhoods aren't just places with needs, but communities of people with underutilized resources, that's the basis for partnership. Community shift is to move beyond blaming government for everything and taking some share of the responsibility. Instead of blaming government for the youth problem, starting to realize, hey, those are our kids. Government shift is to move beyond customer service and citizen participation to community empowerment. And for the community shift is to think and act as citizens rather than as taxpayers. The shift for agencies is never do for communities what they can do for themselves. I was trained as a community organizer in the tradition of Saul Alinsky. And the iron rule of community organizing is never do for people what they can do for themselves. It's the hardest rule for all of us to learn because we're all doing this work because we care deeply about our communities. But often in our desire to help communities, we're taking away their own agency, their own capacity. We're creating dependence. First week I was working as a community organizer. I met with my mentor and he says, Jim, tell me what you did not do this week. I said, man, what do you mean? I've been working so hard. I've done everything. That's the problem. Your job isn't to do for the community. Your job is to help rebuild the capacity of the community to do for themselves. So every week I want you to come back and tell me one more thing you are not doing. The next shift is for government to stop focusing on self-proclaimed leaders and start providing communities with leadership training as well as assistance with outreach and networking. Every city I go to and I talk to the elected officials about we need to empower the community, they look at me like I'm crazy. Why would we want to give those people some power? And when I listen to them, they're talking about the same 10 or 15 people that are in every city in the world who have really big mouths and very small constituencies, who say, I speak for the community, and nobody's behind them. And they take up lots of time. And they don't provide much value. And it's to help those elected officials understand that the problem isn't we have too many of those people, it's we have too few. And democracy only works if it's broad and inclusive. And too oftentimes, agencies are seeing the nonprofit organizations as a surrogate for community. They start treating the nonprofits as if they are the community and speaking for the community. And they're less accountable to the community than government is. Nobody elected them. And the community shift is to make it worth government's while to partner with the community by making it a priority to build broad and inclusive participation. There's no sense in government empowering the community if it's just a few self-selected people. It's got to be everybody. Another shift is the community can't partner with the government to survive by functions. And that's a problem, as I said before, with agencies of all kinds, is we're all focused on our own mission. So in Seattle, we have 32 different departments in our city government. We have our county government, we have our state government with all its departments, federal government with all its departments, we've got our Port of Seattle, we've got our school district, we've got 3 transit agencies, all trying to reach out to the community. And then we've got hundreds of nonprofit organizations. People are being engaged to death. There aren't enough nights in the year to go to all those meetings. And it's not the way anybody experiences the problems in their communities. They don't experience them in the silos. It's in communities that everything comes together. You said we've separated the physical from the environmental, from the economic, from the social. And that's not the way things are in the real world. But in the same way, our communities are divided into many factions. It's not like we have one community out there. We have all kinds of different interest groups. We've got business groups, we've got residential groups, we've got groups from different cultures, we've got young people, we've got old people, all these different interests. So we need to come together in communities with a common vision. Otherwise, it's pretty hard for government to partner with us. Right? You can read the rest of it. But I want to focus on the biggest challenge for government and agencies and the biggest challenge for communities. And just talk about how we address those, okay? So for community, as I said, the biggest challenge is how do we really create broad and inclusive community involvement? So it's not just a few people speaking for the community or doing for the community, but it really is about the whole community. So I want to share some lessons I've learned about how to get more people engaged. And they're not rocket science. These are really simple ideas, but we've forgotten them, I think. Remember I said, I think Robert Putnam said the biggest thing breaking down community is television? I've been stuck in hotel rooms a lot the last couple of weeks. And I've watched a little television. And I thought, oh my God, if this is our competition and we're losing, we're doing something terribly wrong. It should be that hard to compete with television. If we can't make community life more interesting, more satisfying, we're doing something terribly wrong. And I think the problem is we have forgotten how to have fun. We've made community work a drudgery. We've made it our cross to bear. I got a friend who says, Jim, the problem getting people involved in community is those GD activists. I said, GD, what are you talking about? He said, the grim and determined. And it cracked me up because it describes so many of the self-proclaimed community leaders I know in Seattle who are always negative, who just like to complain all the time. In many ways, they become the gatekeepers and keep everybody else away. Because most people, a few people gravitate to negativity, but most people get involved because they have a sense of hope. It's like, why would you get involved unless you think you can make change? I got another friend who says, why have a meeting when you can have a party? Think about it. The purpose isn't who can endure the most suffering. The purpose is to build relationships. And can't you do that a lot more through fun than you can through meetings? And yet we always resort to meetings as a way to try to bring people together. It's stupid. So I want to share a story about a community that learned how to have fun. And because I'm in Holland, it's a tulip story. Okay? So this is in Elgin, Illinois, suburb of Chicago. And I was going around the neighborhood and I saw this big blue wooden tulip in front of somebody's house. I said, that's kind of weird. What's that about? And they told me a story. They said, there's this guy who collects junk. He can't help himself. And he's got all this junk, and his wife gets on his case and says, you got to take that junk back to the dump. So he takes it all back to the dump. But every time he comes back from the dump, he has more than what he left. Some of you know this guy. Yeah. One time he went and saw this huge blue wooden tulip in the dump. He says, man, that is too good to let go to waste. So he brought it back home and he put it in his front yard and he told all the neighbors, come over Friday night because I'm having a blue tulip party. And they're all scratching their heads because nobody had ever heard of a blue tulip party before. But they were curious, so they came over. They had the best time. There was barbecue. There was a band that was playing. They met all their neighbors. They had so much fun that the next Friday night, that blue tulip showed up in front of somebody else's house. And now that blue tulip has been traveling around the city of Elgin for 10 years. Every Friday night in front of somebody else's house. And all week long, the neighbors are walking around trying to figure out, where is that blue tulip going to be this week? And it's built community in a way nothing else could have, because it's fun, it's engaging. We got to lighten up. We're often trying to engage community before we have built community. And the first key is just build those relationships. Rebuild that social fabric. And you can do that a lot more through fun than you can through meetings. Second lesson I learned about getting people involved is you need to start where people are. You'll probably get more people out in a citywide meeting in Amsterdam than you would in a particular neighborhood. You'll probably get more people out in a neighborhood than you would on your street. But you're never going to get a higher percentage of participation than if you involve people right on the street where they live. Because if it's Amsterdam-wide, they're going to say, hey, somebody else will take care of it. I don't have to go. It's on your street. Who's going to do it if I don't do it? And if I don't do it, my neighbor's going to know I'm not involved. They're going to be in trouble. Right? And childcare is easier. Transportation's easier. All kinds of reasons. Secondly, start with their language and culture. Now, even if everybody in your neighborhood is speaking Dutch, you need to be clear you're speaking the same Dutch that they're speaking. And increasingly, we use our increasingly professionalized, specialized language. We use really fancy terms like asset-based community development to mean something really simple, which is just build on your strengths. And when people don't understand what we're talking about, they don't think they have enough expertise to be involved. And we need to be cognizant of their culture. I was doing community organizing in a very multicultural community, large Jewish community. It took me a while to figure out why they weren't showing up to our annual meetings on Saturday. Right? Another part of starting with people is to start with their networks. Too oftentimes we're trying to get everybody to join our group. And we forget that everybody's already organized. They just don't belong to our group. Just about everybody belongs to some kind of network. When I was doing community organizing, I was trying to get people to join a neighborhood association because there was no neighborhood association in this very low-income neighborhood. And I had a lot of success, but it was a lot of work. And I finally woke up and realized everybody already belonged to an organization. So I started just reaching out to different networks and bringing them together. And I tell you, our organizations tend to be one kind of people. We try to create inclusive associations, but they tend to be one kind of people because the leadership's already been set, the agenda's been set, the language is set, the relationships are set, so people who are different don't feel that comfortable coming into the group, one at a time. So if we really want to create inclusive engagement, we need to reach out and find out what associations do they belong to. And how can we find common interests and start working across our different associations. There are hundreds and hundreds of associations in every place. Sporting groups, school-based groups, faith-based groups, hobby groups, drinking groups, all kinds of groups, and finding and reaching out to people the way they're already organized. Fourth is to start with their passions. Oftentimes we're out there leading with our passion, what we're passionate about, or what we get paid to be passionate about, or what we got a grant to be passionate about. And then when nobody joins us, we say, boy, people are apathetic. Nobody's apathetic. Everybody cares deeply about something. So it's much better to start with a question than with an answer. What keeps you awake at night? What are your dreams for your family, for your community? If you can tap into what people care most deeply about, give them a sense they can do something about it, they're much more likely to get involved and spend a lot of time trying to convince them to care about what you care about. So this is a story about starting where people are. This is in Darwin, in England. It's a community of about 50,000 people, and they wanted to figure out how do we get new people involved. So they went where the people were. They bought some cheap living room furniture. They bought a coffee table and a stuffed cat and a flower vase and a rug and just enough furniture to fit in the back of a van. And then they would take it to very public places. So they take it to the front of the church on Sunday morning. They take it to the shopping center on Saturday night. They take it to the sports field on Friday night. And it just looked weird. So people were drawn to it, and they come and they sit down. Now they have a sofa, and they call it the idea sofa, and people are invited to sit down and share their idea for what would make for a better Darwin. So here people are, and it attracts people who would never, ever, ever come to a meeting. And they share their idea, and then everybody who has an idea is invited to come to the school on a Saturday afternoon where they develop, for a workshop, where they develop their idea into a proposal. And at the end of the workshop, they pitch their idea to the whole room. And then everybody in the community votes on which projects they're going to support with their time and up to £1,000. No application form, no contract, just projects. So here's some of the projects. These women start up a soldier support group, clean up the local cemetery. Young people starting up an environmental organization, the Green Cycle program. Working to clean up the local estate and plant daffodils everywhere. Creating a skate park. Organizing a scarecrow festival. Including an invisible scarecrow. But they had 37 projects in the first 6 months of this. And they were all led by people who'd never been active before, because they went out where the people were rather than always waiting for the people to come to them. Third lesson I learned is while it's important to start where people are, you don't leave them there. People need to see results. People are feeling so powerless these days. When I was organizing, I knocked on people's doors to try to find out what the problems were so we could organize around the crisis. So I say, are there any problems in the neighborhood? They'd say, why? You can't fight City Hall. Or I knock on the door and say, are there any problems in the neighborhood? They'd say, why? Are you a lawyer? And the implication was that only lawyers and politicians have any power in our society, which is a pretty sad indictment of a democracy. So we try to give people a sense that by banding together through collective action, they could make change. So we didn't start with world peace or climate change because it's kind of hard to see results. Doesn't mean we shouldn't work on the big issues, but people are never going to work on the big stuff if they don't think they even have power to make change on their own street. So you start with small, winnable issues, small projects. Give people a sense of the value of collective action, then they're more likely to work on the big things. And the fourth lesson is don't sit on your assets. Okay? And the point here is that absolutely everybody in our community, everybody without exception, everybody has gifts to give to our community. Everybody does. And I like to think of them as three kinds of gifts. Gifts of the head, that person's knowledge. Gifts of the heart, that person's passions. And gifts of the hands, that person's skills. Absolutely, everybody's got these. But increasingly in our society, we're putting labels on most of our population that labels them not by their gifts, but by what they are missing. We label people by their deficiencies. We use terms like homeless. When you think about a homeless person, you think about a lot of gifts. You think about what they're missing, a home. I have a friend who's a minister in a church in Cincinnati, Ohio. Members of his church operate a soup kitchen in the basement for homeless men. Finally, one of the members of the church got this idea. Says, why don't we interview these men, find out what their gifts are? Turns out a bunch of these men like to cook. So they asked the men, would you like to help cook the meals in the soup kitchen? They were overjoyed. Nobody ever thought to ask them that before. And after a while, the members of the church and the homeless men are cooking and eating together. And it was kind of hard to tell who were the providers and who were the clients. Because it wasn't about services anymore. It's about community. And in community, we recognize everybody has needs and everybody has gifts. And community is all about meeting each other's needs with each other's gifts. Other terms we use are unemployed, poor person. I got a friend in Ames, Iowa, started a project. She recognized everybody's got poverty in their lives. For some people, poverty is a lack of money. For other people, it's a lack of meaning in relationships. And oftentimes, the people with the most money have the least meaning and the fewest relationships. So she brings people together across class to help each other with their poverty. Really powerful to lift off those labels. Non-English speaking or non-Dutch speaking, where we define people, immigrants, by the one language they don't know. I can't tell you how many refugees I know who know multiple languages. What an incredible gift that could be to our community and helping us connect with so many other parts of our community. And yet we miss out on it because we're focusing on the one language they don't know. Single parent, addict, offender. We never talk about young people in my country anymore without the adjective at risk. And there's some truth to every one of these labels. Young people are at risk. We're all at risk. But it's only part of the truth. We lift off that label. Who's got more energy than young people? Who's got more creativity than young people? Who's got more at stake in the future of our community than young people? And who are the experts on young people more than young people? And we sit around and talk about the youth problem. There's no youth problem. Our problem is we've forgotten to involve the gifts of our young people. An old person. I get increasingly sensitive to that one. We just did a process in my community called Aging Your Way. We brought older people together to talk about what are your dreams. Number one thing we heard, we want the opportunity to contribute. We have spent a whole lifetime getting skills and knowledge, building relationships. And now we're just valued for our needs. We're just valued as clients. Disabled. Where we define people by their disability rather than by their abilities. How many people in this room have no disability? I see some eyeglasses. My disability is my memory. It gets worse every year. But I don't say I have a disability, but please hire me. I try to think of some gifts I have. But there's a huge growing section of our population that we define and think of solely in terms of their disability. And we just focus on what people are missing, they become clients in a service system. And we focus on people's gifts, they become citizens in our community. And I'm not denying that people have needs. Everybody in this room has needs. Everybody in this room requires some services. It's good we have services. But I think most people in this room would be identified and labeled by your gifts. And I think most people outside of this room would be labeled by what they're missing. And then we wonder why those individuals aren't part of our community, why they aren't active in our community. We have defined them out of our community, defining them as clients rather than as citizens. We're frankly just looking at half the glass. We're looking at the useless part of the glass, the part that's half empty. We started a program in Seattle to help our neighborhood associations think about how they could be stronger if they were more inclusive. Because frankly, our associations tend to be whiter and more middle class and more homeowners than the neighborhood as a whole. And we thought, who are the people who are the most left out of community life? We thought they're probably the people with intellectual disabilities. People who'd been institutionalized for years outside of our cities, increasingly living back in our neighborhoods, but not in our community, part of a service system. So we started up a program called Involving All Neighbors, where we focused on the gifts of those individuals as a way to include them in community life. So this is Matt. Matt and his mom came to see me, and Matt says, I've been living in the Ravenna neighborhood now for 8 years. I don't know anybody. I said, Matt, what do you like about your neighborhood? He says, I love Ravenna Creek. He took me to the creek. I knew the neighborhood association was working hard to clean up the creek to make a better salmon habitat. So I talked to Thomas, who was head of the association. I said, Thomas, could you involve Matt in your project? He says, yeah, we can always use more volunteers. So they trained Matt how to remove the invasive holly. And it wasn't long before Matt became the leader. And he was teaching everybody else how to remove the invasive holly. But Matt's greatest gift is he has an incredibly infectious personality. So he knocks on your door, he says, hi, I'm Matt. I really care about the salmon, don't you? You'll help me, won't you? You can't say no to the guy. He's got armies of people cleaning up the invasive holly. He is the #1 volunteer recruiter in his neighborhood. That's his gift. He builds community like nobody else. And he's really creative. At Christmas time, he organizes a holly day party. And all the neighbors collect the invasive holly and they make Christmas decorations. And then he invites everybody to his house afterwards for a big party. And Matt is totally socially uninhibited. He's always the first one on the dance floor. He helps everybody else break out of their shells. That's his gift. This is Susan on the right-hand side. She's chair of her neighborhood association. She wanted to create a more inclusive organization. So she worked with our Department of Social and Health Services and asked them, could you send letters out to all your clients? And the letter said, hi, I'm Susan. I'm chair of the neighborhood association. We'd love to get you involved. If you're interested, give me a call. So she got a call from Raymond and Ginger. She went to their house. We've been living here 20 years. We don't know anybody. She looked around the inside walls of that house, and there were all these crafts on the walls. She said, what's with the crafts? And a lot of them had clown themes in them. They said, that's how we spend our time. We make these crafts. And Raymond here used to be Rayto the clown, but he hasn't clowned in 20 years. Susan said, we're having our Delridge Community Festival on Saturday. Could you come down and do some clowning for us? He was overjoyed. He and Ginger dug through his boxes, found his clown outfit. Susan came and picked him up on Saturday. He was a hit of the festival. The kids loved him. Started inviting him to kids' birthday parties, to other community events. And in the process, he and Ginger met other people who did craft work. They got rides to the craft shows. Susan said they opened doors for her in the neighborhood like nobody else had been able to. And finally, this is Larry. Larry, as you can see, has a disability that makes him totally dependent on public transit. So Larry knows the bus system better than anybody else in this Capitol Hill neighborhood. He knows all the places the bus goes. He knows all the places the bus should go but doesn't go. He knows all the places where there should be covered bus shelters, where there should be better security lighting. So when the neighborhood did their neighborhood plan, they got Larry to help with the transportation element. And Larry led a walking tour to show all the access problems in the business district. Because they weren't just a problem for him, they're a problem for elders with their walkers, parents with their strollers. Larry became so highly valued, he was elected vice chair of the Capitol Hill Community Council. Somebody with intellectual disabilities, somebody who'd been seen as a person with nothing but needs, is now a leader in his community because people thought to lift off that label and focus on his gifts. There's incredible untapped potential in our communities. We just lift off those labels. So I talked about the community challenge. Now I'd like to talk about the #1 challenge for government and agencies of all kinds. And that's about how do we start leading by stepping back and making some room for community. So the key steps government needs to take in order, and all agencies need to take in order to work with communities. First, do no harm. We always want to run out there and do good for people without recognizing often inadvertently we're harming the very communities we're trying to help. And here's some of the ways I think agencies harm communities. One is we're always out there with our agenda, with our priorities, with our programs, with our plans, and we're trying to get we're consulting people about our priorities. We're always setting the agenda. We use very little time for the community to focus on what's most important to them. Secondly, we force the community to be organized the way we're organized, into our silos. Third, I think we're very conscious about how we spend our time because we're being paid. For the most part here, we've got some volunteers, but most people are being paid. But we often take volunteers' time for granted. I know in the public process, we often do lots of consultation without thinking through ahead of time, how are we going to use what we hear? And even if we use what we hear, we don't often feed back to people, here's what we did as a result of what we heard. And if people don't see a connection between their involvement and results, they're going to learn it doesn't pay to be involved. Local government has turned so many people off to citizen participation because they haven't seen the connection between their engagement and results. And time they spend isn't free time, it's valuable time they could be spending with their family, earning an income, watching television. So we need to make people's time valuable. I already talked about this one. Never do for people what they can do for themselves. And then don't think of the nonprofit organizations as a surrogate for community. The second step government needs to take, and other agencies, is to remove the barriers to participation. One of those is centralized decision-making, where decisions are made at this level and people tend to be active at a very local level. So how do we push as many decisions as possible down to the lowest possible level? Cookie-cutter programs and regulations where in the name of efficiency, in the name of fairness, we treat everybody the same. Not recognizing the unique cultural character of the people or the physical character of the place. Inaccessibility. Bureaucratic red tape, that's what stops community initiatives everywhere. Health and safety. Liability. All that red tape, where community groups just want to come and do something, and they're told all the reasons why they can't do it. And know-it-all attitude. Again, not apologizing for the expertise of professionals, but failing to recognize the incredible knowledge in our communities, often of a different kind, where people know their local history. They know their priorities. They know local conditions. And you combine those two kinds of expertise, you get the best possible outcomes. And then third, to rebuild the community's capacity. To offer leadership training. We have high expectations for community members, and yet we give them very few tools to be successful. Lots of training within staff, but very little for community people. To assist with outreach tools like translation. We want groups to be inclusive, and yet we often don't give them the tools to enable them to be inclusive. To work with associations of all types, rather than just the organizations that are organized around our agenda, how do we reach out to all the other ways people are organized in our community so we really get broad and inclusive engagement? To provide forums for networking so all those different associations can start building relationships with each other, start developing consensus, develop a common vision. To offer non-meeting options for engagement. More parties! Projects! Other opportunities for people to get together besides meetings. To share stories of successful communities, to inspire people about what's possible. To highlight community strengths because people are so focused on what they're missing. And to move beyond citizen participation to community empowerment. So just a quick story about how we did this in Seattle with the Department of Neighborhoods. How many have been to Seattle? All right. So this is downtown Seattle, Mount Rainier, Space Needle. But, yeah. In 1988, we organized the first, let me just talk to the keys to creating partnerships between agencies and communities is three major paradigm shifts for agencies. And the first one is to move beyond silos to start focusing on whole places. to looking at how our functions come together in a place. So how do we work as one local government rather than 32 different departments? And how do we work as one set of nonprofit organizations rather than as hundreds of different nonprofits in a place? Because it's totally anti-community, where everybody's trying to reach out and engage the community on their own. And it's also very inefficient. So in Seattle, we created a Department of Neighborhoods. The first time we created a department of local government that was organized in the same way that people were organized, by neighborhood. And it allowed us to work in a very different way. And a key program we put in place was a program of little city halls where people can do business with all layers of government and all departments in one place, in their own neighborhood, in a storefront location. And also where they can do business with all the nonprofits in one place. So one-stop shop. People love it. And it's much more efficient than each department doing its own outreach. And where in each little city hall we have a coordinator. Somebody who works for me in the Department of Neighborhoods, but it's really clear they're working for all the agencies and all the departments of city government. And it's also somebody who's connected with all the associations in the community, every one of them. They often refer to themselves as overt double agents. They're really clear they're working for both government and the community. And their job is to just help connect the two. Second major shift is to move beyond this map of our neighborhoods. And this is the map that tends to be created by agencies. We often say that agencies and professionals need needs. It's a good thing there are needs in communities, or most of us would be out of work. Right? And it's a good thing we have professionals, because there are needs in our communities that can't be addressed adequately by citizens. Oftentimes, the first thing we do in an effort to help communities is to do a needs assessment, to figure out what are all the problems here? How can we be most helpful? And that's a legitimate exercise. But too oftentimes, that's where we stop. And we forget about this map of the same place, which are all its strengths. The gifts of everybody. All the associations, the physical and natural resources, the culture, the identity, the local economy, are all incredible strengths. But we've forgotten about this map of our neighborhoods. And this is the basis for partnerships. With this map, all the power is with the agencies and the professionals, because they're bringing all the resources. And the community's bringing nothing but needs. When the community brings this map, it's a real partnership, because the community's bringing great value and has its own power. There are incredible untapped resources in our communities. So one way we move towards this in Seattle is we started up a program that I talked about before called the Neighborhood Matching Fund. Our community groups are really angry at City Hall because they say you're always putting your money into projects for big developers downtown and not enough into our community priorities. And our elected officials' excuse was, look, if we did it for your neighborhood, we'd have to do it for all the neighborhoods. We'd set a precedent. We can't afford to do it for all the neighborhoods, so we won't do it for any neighborhood. So I said, for projects like that have been a priority for the community, but haven't been a priority for City Hall, let's meet the community halfway. We'll provide a cash match from government in exchange for the community's equal match of volunteer labor. And how about if we make this fund available to any group of neighbors? So it's not just for the nonprofits, it's not for the staffed organizations, it's just neighbors who want to come together. You don't have to be incorporated. And how about if we just fund one-time projects? Because the idea is to build capacity rather than creating dependence. So we won't fund staff or operating costs, just one-time projects. And how about if all the funding decisions are made by the neighborhood leaders themselves? Took this idea to our city council, asked for $150,000, very controversial. Why should we put any money into projects that aren't our priority when we don't have enough money for everything that is? But finally, in a vote of 5-4, not exactly a mandate, they approved $150,000. That first year, we supported 22 community self-help projects. They were so popular that the next year, our council voted unanimously to increase the fund to $1.5 million. They subsequently increased it to $4.5 million a year. Now we support 400 community self-help projects every year in Seattle. This year, we celebrated the 25th anniversary of that program. Over that time, more than 5,000 community self-help projects have happened across the city of Seattle. The city's $60 million investment over the years has leveraged $85 million in community resources The old model where people were looking to government to do everything never would have been tapped. But the best benefit is it's newly involved tens of thousands of people in community life because we've finally given people a way to get involved other than going to meetings. Projects are a great way to get people engaged. Unlike meetings, there's always an outcome. Short-term commitment. It's a role for everybody, young people, elders, people with disabilities, people who never come to the meetings. In the process, they build relationships. And once people build relationships, then they're more likely to come to some meetings. Okay. So every one of our playgrounds in Seattle has been rebuilt by volunteers. Every one of them, in every park and in every school. And it used to be every one of our playgrounds looked exactly the same. I think our Parks Department got a good deal. Now each one reflects what's special about that community. So this is a park developed in Carkeek, where they'd worked for years to clean up the creek to make a better salmon habitat. They finally got the salmon to come back. They said, now we want to get kids back into our park. We need a playground. So they had their design meeting. One of the kids raised his hand and said, I want a salmon playground. The adults are scratching their heads. Nobody'd ever seen a salmon playground before. But an artist said, I've got an idea. And he built a 19-foot-long salmon. It's so big, you slide in the mouth and you come out the tail. And you climb into a cave and you climb over boulders. It gives kids a sense of the struggle that salmon go through to get back to the city of Seattle. Parks all over the city have been redeveloped by community volunteers. This is a park to commemorate Dr. Martin Luther King. All designed and built by volunteers. All kinds of environmental projects. So this is a whole system of rain catchment systems we have downtown where we're capturing water off the roofs of the buildings to irrigate our community gardens. This is something that never would have come out of our city government because it took 7 departments to approve it. You get so much more innovation that comes out of the community. Food security programs. 20 of our most recent community gardens are built by immigrants and refugees in social housing. And there they're able to grow food indigenous to their culture, but they're also able to sell the produce and make some income. Renovating facilities. This is an old log cabin that was rotting away in West Seattle, and the community renovated it with volunteers to make it an historical museum. We not only fund neighborhood communities, but we also fund cultural communities because often, particularly for immigrants and refugees, they identify with their culture before they identify with their place. So this is our Eritrean community that was concerned they were losing their kids to the streets. The kids were getting involved in gangs. So they used matching funds to build their own cultural center. And they're using that to reintegrate their young people back into their culture. Youth development programs. We had a whole area in the south of downtown that was just covered with graffiti. And there was a guy working in the local factory who came up with a great idea and says, why don't we involve the kids who get busted for graffiti, give them an alternative sentence where they could help create murals. Now young people have created over 1,500 murals. More than 5,000 young people participated. And we found that as long as the kids are involved in this program, not one of them is reoffended. And finally, the third shift is about moving from top down to bottom up. About how do we get community agencies of all kinds to support community initiatives. So in Seattle, we started up a neighborhood planning program where we actually give money to neighborhoods to hire their own planner who's accountable to the community. But we wouldn't give them the money until they brought all the stakeholders together. People representing all aspects of the community, all the different factions. And out of it came 38 bottom-up plans. In my neighborhood, very low-income community, they put pressure on local government to finally build a community center. It was the neighborhood of Seattle that had the highest percentage of young people, but hadn't had a voice, so they never had a community center. So we got the city to build the biggest community center in the city because we involved thousands of people in the planning process. So this plan didn't just sit on the shelf, there was a mandate for it. But the reason I'm showing these pictures in the foreground, you see ball fields. My wife, as a volunteer, took the lead on this, and we built dozens of ball fields all over our community to give girls an opportunity to play ball, because we didn't have enough ball fields. All built by community members. And we had a business district that was totally boarded up. Prostitution and drug dealing on the streets, all boarded up. We couldn't get any businesses to come in. So finally somebody said, if we can't get real businesses, let's pretend. Painted all the boarded up doors and storefronts to make it look like there were businesses. People got excited. Cars were stopped. People wanted to get out and shop. Within a year, we had to take down every one of the murals because real businesses wanted to get in on the action. So this is what it looked like 1 year later. with an Italian deli, with a brew pub, with a co-op art gallery that also came out of the neighborhood plan. They also fixed up another storefront and put in a bike store. But it's for used bicycles that hadn't worked for years. They trained at-risk youth how to fix the bicycles. And every kid who graduates from the program earns his or her own bicycle. They've now fixed so many bicycles that hundreds of kids have earned their own. They give bicycles to homeless kids, to foster kids. They send 500 bicycles a year to the people of Africa. And this is out of a neighborhood that was seen as a place with nothing but needs. Incredible power, and give power back to the people. These plans don't sit on the shelf. The community holds government accountable, but they also take a lot of responsibility for implementation themselves. Because there's a lot communities can do that government can't do. In Diers, they created a 4-mile trail system along the creek. They fixed up the old school that had been boarded up for 17 years and turned it into a multicultural center. And they brought in the school for kids that had been kicked out of every other school in Seattle as the anchor tenants. And they fixed up the old gymnasium as a movement studio. They fixed up the old cafeteria as a theater. They turned the 37 classrooms into live work units for low-income artists who help program the space down below with young people. And they demanded that they get a library like every other neighborhood. Before the city even had a chance, they designed the library themselves, and they built 34 units of low-income housing up above it. That's something that would never come out of our city government because our city government, the library department just builds libraries, and our housing department just builds housing. You get much more holistic solutions coming out of the community. You have time for one more story? Because I've just talked about government, and I realize a lot of you are with a nonprofit organization. So I want to talk about nonprofits moving in the same direction. Okay? So this is High Point. This is a social housing development in Seattle. Very low income, very multicultural. And there was a nonprofit organization called High Point that got a grant to create a healthy community. And they advertised the meeting and said, we want people to come out and help us figure out how to create a healthy community, and nobody came. So they did the sickest thing in the world. They started paying people to come to their meetings. So they had a paid advisory committee. And they met with the paid advisory committee and asked them, what kind of ideas do you have for creating more health in our community? And they came up with a long list. But it was all things for agencies to do, because that's how things get done in High Point. Where there are more agencies, there's more professionals than residents. So they asked me to come in. I said, well, could you get your neighbors involved? And they said, you know, health isn't the top of their priority. Fitness, nutrition, that's not the biggest thing. I said, what's important to you? They said, we just want to create an awesome community. I said, would people come out if we had a gathering about how to create an awesome community? They said, if we had some good food, people would come. I said, I just have a little bit of budget. I could pay for the ingredients. Could you make the food? People came with food from all over the world. We had just an incredible feast of food. People were so proud to bring their own dishes. And then somebody said, you know, if we had good entertainment, people would come. I said, what entertainment do you have? And one of the seniors said, I belong to a line dance group. And they showed up, and some of them even showed up with their walkers. And they were doing the line dance. But the kids loved it. They jumped up and they joined it and said, can we do this with you every month? And then they said if we had raffle prizes, people would come. I said, what could you raffle? And one woman said, I make a great apple pie. I'll bring that. Somebody else said, I do knitting. I'll bring a scarf. And somebody else said, I'll donate a couple hours of gardening. We had so many raffle prizes, we were raffling for a half hour. And they were all things from the community. And then I asked people to sit around and brainstorm about what would create a more awesome community. What are some projects that would create an awesome community? People came up with lists of ideas. And I said, we don't have any budget to implement any of these ideas, so none of them are going to happen unless you take responsibility. So this woman said, I just moved here from China. I want to start up a tea house as a way to create a gathering place for the neighbors. And there were some Somali elders in the corner who said, we don't drink tea, we drink coffee. She said, okay, we'll have a tea and coffee house. So they came together to start planning that. This guy said, I like to exercise, but I'm a terrible organizer. If people will help me organize the classes, I'd be happy to lead them. This woman said, I love to play soccer, but because of my religion, I can't play outdoor soccer. I want to start up an indoor soccer rink. This woman said, this is an incredible multicultural feast we made tonight. I'd like to start up a multicultural catering company. It's a way for us to make some income and share our gifts with the larger community. That's something we can do that no other neighborhood can do. This young man, he was the most poised of all. His name's Solomon. He stood up there and says, all my friends in all the other neighborhoods have parks and playgrounds. I want a swing set. And he just tugged at everybody's heartstrings. And there are some elders in the corner who says, you know, we do regular walks around the neighborhood for exercise, and we get tired. We'd like, how about if we create a park with a bench and a swing set? 6 months later, the neighbors came together to build that park. And they built the bench. And the housing authority says you can't do a swing set because of health and safety. And the committee said, Solomon's counting on a swing set. We're going to build it. So here's the swing set, and here's Solomon. But that's the power of doing work in a different way. Not every one of these projects happened, but a bunch of others did. They got the local pharmacy to stock fresh produce because there was no grocery store in the neighborhood. They started up a community orchard. They started up a community garden. They started up a craft group where now these low-income women are making sweaters for Nicholsville, a homeless encampment, watching out for people who are worse off than they are. And if you think about it, every one of these projects improved the health of the residents. But it only happened because we didn't focus on health. We focused on what was important to the residents. The stronger we're pushing our agenda as professionals, the more we own it. We need to lead by stepping back. Do our work in a very different way. Start working across agencies. Focus on the community, focus on the place, focus on people's strengths, and focus on their priorities. And that's the way we're going to turn this around and create more equality between these two ways of working. Service delivery and community building.
Thank you, Jim.
I can keep going. Yeah. This is from the, I mean, stuff's happening here in the Netherlands.